Let's see. Thank you for reminding me. So, as I said, Cyrus made the first Balfour Declaration allowing the Jews to go back. And it appears that the scroll of Esther, since the king, Ahasuerus, is a Persian king, whether he's Xerxes or Artaxerxes, he seems to be not during the Babylonian period, but at the end of the exile already. After Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel already went back to Judea with a few thousand people. But again, the story, trying to find the story, trying to look for documents that might corroborate the story are very difficult to find. We don't have, aside from the Book of Esther, we don't have much else, not even really artifacts to try to prove the story. It's also too far back in time. But the Maccabean story, the story of Chanuka, we have really a lot of details about that story. We know exactly when it happened in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And we have at least 5 sources for it. So some of them written basically at that time. So what are our sources? The story of Chanuka. First of all, the rebellion of the Maccabees. It's from 167 before the Common Era until 164. It's a little hard to write on this whiteboard, but almost 3 years, 165, 164. It's almost a 3-year rebellion. And this is, of course, before the Common Era. Oops. Now, what happened in that time? Let's go backwards in time a little bit. 332, before the Common Era, that's when Alexander the Great, Sasha the Great, conquered this part of the world, meaning Israel. Alexander dies at a very young age. He was only 32 years old. Did anybody see the movie Alexander? Never saw the movie? If you saw the movie, then you know who his mother was.
Yes, his mother, I remember, but I don't remember the movie very
Angelina Jolie was his mother. So one thing interesting about the movie of Alexander, which was portrayed correctly, is that the Greeks, when they took over societies, they normally did not care to change those societies. They tried to influence those societies with Greek culture, but if those societies wanted to keep their own culture and their own religion, that didn't bother the Greeks. Mentioning that because in the Chanuka story, it's very strange because Antiochus IV of the Seleucid kingdom, for some reason, and different than his predecessors, and also different from the ones who came after him of Seleucid government, for some reason wanted to Hellenize Judea. It's hard to know exactly why. There's speculation. Some people say he was a little bit unusual psychologically, but he definitely was different than the monarchs who came before him. Now, who are the monarchs? Who are the Seleucids? Let me go back to this. When Alexander dies, his kingdom is broken up to 4 parts. You have Ptolemy, who takes over Egypt. He's one of the 4 generals. It's very hard to write. You have Seleucid. I think Seleucus. I'll write Seleucid, because that's the name of the empire. He takes over Syria, Mesopotamia, and Western Asia. It's called the Seleucid Empire. Then you have Sander. Oops. Sander takes over Macedonia. Then you have Antigonus, takes over Antalya. For our story, we're only interested in Seleucid. There were fights between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids over Judea, quite a few wars over that area. Okay, so that's what I want to. Now, under the Seleucids, you had Seleucid 1, Seleucid 2, Seleucid 3. You also had Antiochus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The Chanuka story happens under Antiochus the fourth. Is also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. Also called, he's number 4, Epiphanes. Epiphanes. Oops. And he's number 4. Okay. Now that it took such a long time to write that, I'll just make it disappear. But it's still there. So the Chanuka story is a revolt which takes place from 167 to 164 before the Common Era under the kingdom, the Seleucid kingdom, which is a Greek Seleucid kingdom under Antiochus Epiphanes, is Antiochus the Fourth. So, what sources do we have for the Chanuka story? Well, the source which is the most prominent is, of course, the Book of Maccabees. First one is the Book of Maccabees. I'm not going to write it out, just it takes me a long time to write here. Maccabees 1 in particular.
May I ask you something? Epiphanes wasn't the one who considered himself as a god and wanted to be worshipped and instaurate Hellenistic, and he was
very, that's very possible because he was pushing Hellenism on the countries that, yes.
That was what I was saying, and he forced the revolt of the Maccabees.
Yes.
Okay.
That's why supposedly he had a bad name in his lifetime, and people used to call him, instead of Epiphanes, Epimanes, which meant the crazy one. Loco. So Nibun. And so yeah, he pushed Hellenism in ways which his predecessors did not, because it was not politically wise to do such a thing. In the end of the day, you want these countries and these peoples to be happy citizens and just give you the taxes and their loyalty. You don't really need more than that. So it's actually, there's a lot of questions among historians exactly what caused this among him. What was just the way he was? Were there political reasons? Were there people who influenced him? These are some of the discussions. Book of Maccabees 1 is our most important document. It's written by an anonymous Jewish writer who probably knew the Maccabees. He lived very close to that generation. Some people think during the time of Alexander Janus, which is about 120 before the Common Era, but it's not exactly clear, but it is clear that it was written near the end of the revolt. So probably in his lifetime, maybe as a child, he lived through the revolt. Maccabees 2, by the way, is written by Jason of Kiren, which was a Jewish historian, and he's basically summarizing some of the ideas. The book is actually summarizing the things from Jason of Kiren, and it starts off mentioning the fact that Judah sent a letter to the Jews of Alexandria in Egypt, the year after the Hanukkah story, asking them to keep the festival of Chanuka just like they are doing in Judea. That's the way it starts. Another interesting thing in Maccabees 2 is that they claim that one of the reasons why Hanukkah is 8 days was to mimic the holiday of Sukkot, of Tabernacles, which had 7 days of tabernacle and 1 day of Shmini Atzeret, which means it was 8 days. So since the temple was defiled and they weren't able to keep that holiday, when they purified the temple, they wanted a holiday of 8 days. That's according to Maccabees 2. We'll see, though, that according to Maccabees 1, it seems to be because it was just named after the dedication of the altar. What other source do we have? We have Josephus in his Antiquities. Book 12, chapter 4, 6 to 7. Parts 6 to 7. So Josephus in the Antiquities. In addition, oops, something happened here. I can't go down. In addition, we have, why can't I write? I don't know. Hold on, something happened. Okay, in addition to Josephus, we also have it's called the Scroll of Ta'anit. The Scroll of Ta'anit means the scroll of fast days, literally. It's called the Scroll of Ta'anit, the Scroll of Fast Days. The Scroll of Fast Days was a book that was written during the Hasmonean Kingdom, somewhere at the end of the 2nd century before the Common Era. And the reason why it was written, it's a collection of days of what we would call civil holidays during the Second Temple period. Just like in Romania, you have a civil holiday coming up on December 1st. These holidays were very often in honor of battles that were won. For an example, there was a general whose name was Nicanor, who was a sort of a Greek general. And when he fell in battle against the Hasmoneans, which was on the 12th day of the Hebrew month of Adar, it became a minor holiday, like a civil holiday. And all the days that were civil holidays, they told people not to fast on those days, not to do post, not to fast, and also not to eulogize at a funeral for the dead, not to make it more sad than it is, because these are considered happy days. And there was a whole list of these days in the Second Temple period, days in which battles were won. And if you read even Maccabees number 1, you'll see how many battles they had just in those 3 years. So there were many battles to commemorate. And that's what they had in this book. In addition to the battles that they commemorate, they also mention the Purim holiday, which they had known from before, because that was already instituted at the beginning of the Second Temple period. And they also mention Chanuka, which happened at the beginning of the Hasmonean Kingdom. So that's why it's also a source for the Chanuka story. And of course, another source that we have is the Hebrew prayer book, Sidur, because there is a prayer which we read on the festival of Hanukkah, which is called Al Hanisim, a prayer regarding miracles. And it mentions the Hanukkah story. Why is this a source? Because this prayer, mentioning the Hanukkah story, goes back at least to the 9th century. And if it's in the Sidur of Saadia Gaon in the 9th century, it could be that it predates it. Why do we think it might predate the 9th century? Because in the Scroll of Ta'anit, it actually says that they instituted 2 things. They instituted a prayer called the Hallel, which is a known prayer that we say on festivals. meaning they instituted that one should recite that prayer even on the festival of Chanuka, despite the fact that it's not from the Bible. And they also instituted a prayer of thanks. And this prayer that we add into the morning and afternoon prayers is exactly during the benediction of thanks. So there are a lot of people who think that this prayer is the prayer that's already being mentioned in the scroll of Ta'anit. Even if it went through some changes, it could very well be that it's quite an early prayer, meaning some maybe already from the 1st century before the Common Era. Okay, so these are our basically our sources: Maccabees 1 and 2, Josephus' Antiquities, the scroll of Ta'anit, which is a very short description, and the prayer in the prayer book, which is also a very short description of Hanukkah. So let's look at some of them. Is it? Okay, we are back to our source sheet. On the source sheet, I put 2. I put them exactly where we talk about the Apocrypha. So, okay, this is it. Can you see this? Could not find the Romanian. If somebody has a Bible here with Maccabees 1 in Romanian, so it's Maccabees 1, chapter 4, verse 36, until verse 48. Maccabees 1, chapter 4, verse 36. Does anybody have it in their Bible, maybe?
I don't have Maccabees in my Bible.
Okay, anybody?
Or do I can't find Maccabees. I don't know
Okay.
if there are any similarities with something, so we
Okay, I thought they had it. but no.
can equivalate somehow.
Okay, so if I read in English, will you be able to follow? Maybe try to look on Google to see if you have Maccabees in Romanian, because if I look in English, it'll be hard for me to find. You have it?
Yes, I do have.
Okay, did you find it? Chapter 4, verse 36 in Maccabees 1.
Yes.
And it's what is it? Then Judah says to his brothers, behold, our enemies are discomfited.
Și au zis Iuda și frații lui,
Yeah.
iată-i, nimiciți pe vrăjmașii noștri, să ne suim, să curățăm sanctuarul și să-l înnoim.
Excellent. Continue, please.
Și s-a adunat toată oștirea și s-a suit în muntele Sionului.
They went out to Mount Zion. If you know Jerusalem, the old city, Mount Zion today, if you're looking at the old city from the west, Mount Zion is to the right. That's where you have the Church of the Dormition is on Mount Zion. That's where you have King David's tomb today is on Mount Zion. It's just outside the wall. Okay, please.
Și a văzut locul sfânt pustiit, jertfelnicul pângărit, porțile arse și în curți răsărite tufe, ca într-o pădure sau ca într-un munte și locuințele surpate. I continue?
Yeah. Unless it's difficult for you. So, yeah, continue. I'll tell you when to stop. If I can.
Și și-au rupt hainele, s-au tânguit cu tânguire mare, și-au pus cenușă pe cap, și au căzut cu fața la pământ și au trâmbițat cu trâmbițele și au strigat la cer. Atunci a rânduit Iuda bărbați ca să hărțuiască pe cei din cetate până ce se va curăți templul. Și a ales preoți.
Now you're at 42, right?
Yes.
Okay, so continue until, let's say, continue until 59. That's okay.
Și a ales preoți fără de prihană, credincioși legii lui Dumnezeu, și au curățit sfintele și au adus pietrele necurăției la loc necurat. Și s-a sfătuit.
When they talk about the defiled stones in 43, what is a defiled stone? How does it become defiled? Can you guess what they mean by defiled, by impure? How does the stone become impure in the temple? I'll tell you. Under Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus started Hellenizing Judea. And they went very far. They decided to bring the Roman gods into the temple and worship the Roman gods. That paganism was called defying the temple and was called making it impure. So since they used the altar for sacrifices to the gods of Rome, that's why it was called unclean or impure. That's what it means. It's defiled by the paganism, by the worship of other gods. Okay. Number 44.
Și s-au sfătuit pentru jertfelnicul arderii de tot cel pângărit, ce vor face cu el. Și le-a venit sfat bun ca să-l strice, ca nu cumva să le fie spre o cară, că l-au pângărit neamurile și au stricat jertfelnicul. Și au dus pietrele în muntele templului, în loc bun, până va veni prorocul ca să răspundă pentru ele. Și au luat pietre întregi, după lege, și au zidit un jertfelnic nou, ca și cel mai dinainte. Și au zidit templul și cele dinăuntrul templului și curțile. Și-au făcut vase sfinte noi și au băgat sfeșnicul, jertfelnicul arderilor de tot și al tămâierilor și masa în templul Domnului.
Okay, how far did you go now? To what number?
49.
Yes. So you can see they made new vessels. Also brought in the candlestick, which means the candelabra, called out in Hebrew the menorah. The candlestick, the candelabra, it's called the menorah in Hebrew. It has 7 candlesticks on it. And also the altar of the burnt offerings, of the incense, and the table, which is really the bread table. Or they call it the show table. Okay, 50.
Și au tămâiat pe jertfelnic și au aprins lumânările cele de pe sfeșnic și luminau în templul Domnului. Și au pus pe masă pâini și au întins vălul catapetezmei și au săvârșit toate lucrurile ce aveau de făcut. Și au mâncat dimineața în 25 de zile ale lunii a 9-a, care este luna Kislev a anului 148.
Right. So this is the way we celebrate it today. The 25th day of Kislev, the Hebrew month of Kislev, which is next Monday or Sunday night. And it says in the 148th year, it's the 148th year of the Seleucid Empire. Meaning since Seleucid the first was king, it's 148 years later. Okay. That's the way they used to count. They didn't have calendars. Calendars were always to the kings. New king, new calendar. That's the way it worked. Yes. Okay, 53.
Și au adus jertfă după lege pe jertfelnicul arderilor de tot cel nou, pe care îl făcuseră. Pe vremea și în ziua în care l-au pângărit pe el neamurile, într-o aceea s-a înnoit cu cântări și cu alăute și cu harpe și cu chimbale.
Yeah, this is also interesting. At that time, on the same day, the heathens had profaned the temple, and the same day was dedicated with songs, with harps, with cymbals, which means on that 25th day of Kislev, not only was it the day that they rededicated the temple, it was the day that 3 to 4 years ago, Antiochus and the Seleucids brought the idols into the temple. So the same day that it was defiled, years later was the same day that it was purified. Okay, 55. 55 and 56.
Și a căzut tot poporul cu fața la pământ și s-a închinat și a binecuvântat pe Dumnezeu cerului, cel care i-a ajutat. Și au făcut înnoirea jertfelnicului în 8 zile și au adus arderi de tot cu veselie și au jertfit jertfă de pace și de laudă.
Right. So basically, you see, they dedicated the altar for 8 days, and that became Chanuka. Chanuka, by the way, in Hebrew means to dedicate. So it's the dedication of the altar. And it must have been a ceremony that they did over an 8-day period, and therefore Chanuka is 8 days. And we're again at the 10-minute mark. I just want to read 59. Judah and his brothers and the whole congregation of Israel ordained that the days of the dedication of the altar should be kept every year in that season, meaning on the 25th day of Kislev, from year to year, by the space of 8 days, from the 5 and 20 of the month of Kislev, with gladness. So that was the institution of Chanuka as an 8-day festival, starting on the 25th day of the Hebrew month of Kislev, and that's the way we keep it until today. So this is and why is it 8 days? Because the altar or was dedicated over that period, and I guess the altar symbolized the dedication of the whole temple. The altar had to be made new because it was defiled by the pagan practices of the Greeks, of the Seleucids who were there before. Now I want to read to you Josephus' Antiquities. There's a little bit, but I don't know. Does anybody have that in Romanian? Josephus' Antiquities? So I'll just read it. It's 2 short chapters. When the generals of Antiochus's army had been beaten so often, Judah assembled the people together and told them that after many victories which God had given them, they ought to go to Jerusalem and purify the temple and offer the sacrifices. But as soon as he and the whole multitude came to Jerusalem, they found the temple deserted. Its gates were burned down. There were plants growing in the temple. And on the account of its desertion, he and those who were with him began to lament and were confounded at the sight of the temple. So they chose some of the soldiers and told them to fight the guards of the citadel until they had purified the temple. When they had purified the temple, they brought in new vessels, new candlesticks, new tables for the bread, an altar made of gold. He hung up the veils of the gates and added doors, and he took down the altar of the burnt offerings and built a new one of stones that they had gathered and were not made of iron tools. You notice something already that Josephus is leaving out of the story? Josephus is a very smart historian. He knows when he has to censor things. He just censored something from the story. Can anybody realize what he just left out? According to the book of Maccabees, why did they build a new altar? What was the reason? And what is the reason that Josephus gives? He gives a totally different reason. Anybody? I'll explain. According to the book of Maccabees, the reason why the altar was destroyed was it was used for worship of idols by the Seleucid Greeks. According to Josephus, the reason why the altar was destroyed was because it was not, they had to make it not with metal, but with stones. He also says, according to Maccabees, the temple was defiled because it was used for idol worship. According to Josephus, the temple was defiled because it was destroyed and there was grass growing in it. Do you notice the difference? In other words, Josephus, writing for the Romans, doesn't want to say that paganism destroys a Jewish temple because the Romans were pagans. You understand the problem? The Romans worshipped idols. So Josephus doesn't want to say that when you worship idols, it defiles the Jewish temple because that would be an offense to the Romans. Then they would say, even Zeus or even our idols would defile your temple. So that's an offense. It's very offensive. So he doesn't say that. He says the reason why they had to rededicate the temple was because the gates were burned down and it was deserted and there were plants growing. That's not at all what it says in the book of Maccabees. In the book of Maccabees, it doesn't say at all that the gates were burnt down and there were plants growing. He made it up. It says because it was used for pagan worship. Okay, so as I said, Josephus knows who's reading the books, and he has to be very careful because the Romans can read the books too. So he has to be careful. Now I'm continuing. On the 5th and 20th day of the month of Kislev, the Macedonians called Apolleians. They lighted the lamps and the candlesticks and offered incense on the altar. That's taken directly from the book of Maccabees. And they put loaves of bread on the show table and offered burnt offerings on the new altar that they built. And it just so happened that these things were done on the very same day that their divine worship had stopped. It was reduced to profane and common use. Again, he doesn't say all the idol worship. Again, he leaves it out. Okay. For 3 years, the temple was desolate by Antiochus. Not true. It wasn't desolate. They purposely brought sacrifices to pagan gods. This desolation happened to the temple in the 145th and on the 125th day of the month of Apollonians, the 150 and 30 Olympiad, and it was dedicated on the same day, the 25th month of the Apollonians, the 148th year of the Seleucid Empire, the 154th Olympiad. And this desolation came to pass according to the prophecy of Daniel, which was given 408 years before, where he said that the Macedonians would dissolve the worship of the Jews. He doesn't mention that they brought in pagan gods. Now, Judah celebrated the festival of the restoration, the sacrifices of the temple for 8 days, and he omitted no sort of pleasure, and he feasted upon a rich and splendid sacrifices and honored God, delighted with hymns and psalms, were very glad at the revival of their customs. And after a long intermission, they unexpectedly had regained the freedom of worship. I made it a law for their posterity. They should keep a festival on account of the restoration of the temple for 8 days. From that time, we celebrate this festival. We call it the Festival of Lights. It's Josephus who says that Chanuka is called the Festival of Lights. Which is he's the first one to tell us that, but it must have been the way that it was named already at the end of the Second Temple. I suppose the reason was because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and this was the name given to the festival. Judah also rebuilt the walls around the city, reared towers of great height, and set guards and fortified the city of Bethsura, etc. Now, the interesting thing here is there a second thing Josephus leaves out, which is very obvious from the book of Maccabees. Josephus does not mention that Judah took back Jerusalem from the Seleucids. He says Chanuka celebrates Jewish freedom of worship. He doesn't say that that was the day that they took over the temple and they regained sovereignty of Jerusalem, because he doesn't want to say that. Because the Romans would say, wait, we don't want them to have a festival which is celebrating a confrontation with an empire which they won. That's not a very good festival for us. By the way, in the Bar Kokhba revolt, in 132 to 135 of the Common Era, when the Jews rebelled against the Romans, they said, remember the Chanuka and the Hasmoneans. What they did to the Seleucid Greeks, we can do to the Romans. That was their motto. It didn't work, but that was their motto. So Josephus realizes that if he calls Chanuka the regaining of Jewish sovereignty over Judea, the Romans are going to take it out of the book. So he calls it the restoration of the freedom of religion, that they could keep their practice and their in the temple. So he basically censors two things. Number one, he doesn't mention the fact that the Seleucid government used the Jewish temple for pagan practice, which is obvious from the book of Maccabees. And number two, he censors out that Hanukkah was not just a festival of the restoration of the temple service, but it was also the regaining of a Jewish sovereignty in Jerusalem and over Judea, which was actually given to them by the Seleucid government.